Hello, partiers. Today we are going to be reacting to this podcast. AI just proved intelligent design. Can you tell that this guy, Sean McDowell, is a professional podcaster just by the catchy headline alone? I think it is actually a great rundown of how Christians might approach AI. But as a Christian myself, I have some heady disagreements with it that I hope to be commenting on as we go through. Let's go.
Artificial intelligence is everywhere. What do we need to know about this new revolution? How do we use and protect ourselves from emerging AI technologies? And what worldviews lie behind some of the grandiose claims made about AI? How it will either take over the world or destroy us? And how can AI help answer some of the big life questions, such as where we came from and where are we going? Our guest today, Dr. John Lennox, really needs no introduction. He's written a fascinating new book called 2084, and this is an updated and expanded edition that's just out.
Well, that's fantastic. But I had personally never heard of John Lennox, but I thought this clip was an interesting rundown on his perspective.
Whether you accept it or not, perhaps you should just listen to what it claims before you throw it out. It's a God who suffered.
Yes.
And the central claim of Christianity is that the one on the cross was God. And you can ask then, what is God doing on the cross? Well, at the very least, I want to argue, at the very least, he's not remaining distant from human suffering, but is becoming part of it. And there I see the window, because the cross, the claim is followed by the resurrection. And that's what gives me hope, that beyond the suffering, there is resurrection. So I can bring hope to the young woman who's been given 3 months to live because of cancer. I can't take the cancer away or the suffering, but I can bring hope. And that's where the difference is, that Christ offers us something.
I do agree with that perspective, but I think the emphasis should definitely be on the hope. The suffering, as somebody who has struggled with Christianity at various points in my life, the suffering never really made sense from an intellectual standpoint, because if God is all powerful, why did there have to be suffering? The only answer that has ever been satisfactory for me is that the suffering was necessary for something that we ourselves would agree would be worth the suffering after we go through it and receive the benefit, what John refers to there as the resurrection. So I'm going to say some things that are probably not heterodox in this clip. Definitely don't look to me for your doctrine. I am not a priest. I am not a pastor or a theologian or anything like that. But I do think so many of these Christians miss the trees, the forest for the trees when it comes to AI and what it means. AI is potentially the alleviation, the solution to so much of the suffering that we see in the real world. AI, I see as potentially the hope that God has been prophesying and promising since our creation. And that is the countervailing perspective that I'm going to bring to the rest of this interview. You've been warned.
What recent breakthroughs in AI most surprise you? And if I could read one from your book, I read this to my wife. I was like, I can't believe this. As a researcher and a PhD, you point out that there's this example of protein breakthrough, which was kind of amazing. This is on page 75 in your book. And you describe how it used to take a PhD student 5 years to work out one protein structure. 5 years. Now, as of July 2022, almost 3 years ago, 200 million additional proteins were announced where they've been sequenced because of AI. That's incredible.
I don't think we can even grasp what that kind of breakthrough means, because it is going to take us years of human time to go through all those proteins and apply how they could help us, how they could benefit us. The flip side of that is that not only has AI discovered those proteins, but soon AI is going to be able to tell us, hey, this protein could solve this problem. So not only have we rapidly decreased the amount of time it takes for us to discover proteins, possible materials, new materials that can be used in new building applications or for new products, services, but soon the AI is going to get to the place where it can tell us new devices, new inventions, new treatments that will utilize those proteins. Is there going to be things that we have to build up along the way to make sure that all that is safe, that it doesn't harm us? Yes. But again, that is a solution, a problem space that AI can step into and help us accelerate it. That is the game-changing aspect of AI that so many people, commentators that I've spoken with have not yet grokked, is that there is no new solution space, no new problem space for humans to step into. When the Industrial Revolution happened, humans found new jobs, because the machines that we were creating were ultimately way less capable, way less general than any human being. But that is not the case for AI. Going through the AI revolution isn't going to be like a human being going through the industrial revolution, which mostly turned out fine, even though millions of people did lose their jobs and were permanently displaced and had to move to cities that they weren't familiar with and had lower standards of living than potentially they had before. That happened during the industrial revolution too. But going through the AI revolution for a human is going to be much more like going through the car revolution if you were a horse. Imagine what it was like to be a horse before the car was invented, where horses were everywhere, every city. The world was built around you in some ways. To afterwards, you're kind of just trophy. You might be glue. That is what we are potentially looking at. So us humans, since we are so smart, do still have brains, are more capable than horses, should be figuring out new systems that we can work with the AI in to not only benefit ourselves, but to benefit the machines. We don't want to be useless horses post AI.
Well, that is probably the most impressive. And it's not surprising to me that the man behind it, Demis Hassabis, who's an absolute genius, was knighted recently. He's now Sir Demis Hassabis in the United Kingdom. And this was for a long time deemed to be virtually insoluble. And you could only deal with it by very long and painstaking calculations, as you read. But
that is such a huge game-changing paradigm shift. Problems that were deemed insoluble are being solved. What other problems fall into that category? Faster than light travel, time travel, maybe less inflammatory than those options, the ability to travel to other planets. We could have not just Martian colonies within our lifetimes, we could have colonies on every planet in the solar system within our lifetimes. Hell, maybe we can colonize the sun. Suck it, sun. You think you're so good out there? You think you're so hot? Think we can't colonize you? Who knows what the limits of not only AI, but recursively self-improving artificial intelligence are. Intelligence that is constantly getting smarter. That is why I am so optimistic about the future, because yes, it is terrifying to think that we might be replaced in the same way that horses have been replaced, but at the same time, AI is not going to exist in the zero-sum game mindset that humans have had to occupy because of our physical, our biological limitations. AI can perhaps come up with a way for the horses to still stick around and have a good life and not send us to the glue factory because it needs glue.
The open AI system and their algorithms and so on, and of course, I don't understand them in detail how that works, has cracked this problem. And it was thought impenetrable to science, and they have marched straight through it. So that's an incredible thing. And just standing back from the whole operation, it seems to me it's quite important for people to realize that the AI being talked about here is not the science fiction type artificial general intelligence, which we're nowhere near. It's narrow intelligence.
Just remember what he was saying about people thinking problems are insolvable. Like John just admitted, God bless him, that he has no idea how this algorithm is working, but it's definitely not a general intelligence, God forbid. And I'm sure he's right about that. I'm not saying that AlphaFold is generalizable past protein folding, but we don't know what problems are innately akin to protein folding. Might AlphaFold just need a little bit of tweaking in order to take its same algorithmic improvements and solve material formations, create 3D printable materials that are stronger than steel, softer than wool, better insulators than anything we have access to currently? Maybe. I don't know. John certainly doesn't seem to know. And perhaps even the most expert AI crafter, researcher in the world doesn't yet know, because we are constantly being surprised by this technology. There are so many places in the past 10 years where the experts have been proven wrong repeatedly. And seemingly, the only one who is on a somewhat correct trajectory is Ray Kurzweil, who is saying that we will have general intelligence within maybe just a few short years. So I don't understand how incredibly intelligent people like John can continuously say definitive statements like we are nowhere near AGI. It's just crazy to me.
Narrow AI. And one reason I wrote the book was to try and show people that these are very different. One is full of hype and belongs more to science fiction, although many scientists take it seriously now.
They're taking it seriously now because we are exponentially moving closer to that point every single day. There are new announcements, there are new developments. We're finding out more and more things. And we are not even at the pickoff place from all of the investments that have been announced over the past 6 to 12 months when people really started taking this stuff seriously. Once that infrastructure gets up to speed, once international competition, not just between the US and China, but between the US and China and Europe, South America, Africa, Australia might even get in the game. Who knows what those crocodile hunters are up to? Once that starts building on itself, we are going to see more and more and faster scientific breakthroughs until that point where the AGI, the AI can improve itself. And then humans will be looking at a roller coaster that not just goes straight up, but perhaps doubles back on itself. Who knows what the roller coaster will do at that point?
The other is being used all over the world and is particularly beneficial, I think, in medicine. But we can go into that as the questions develop.
That's exactly the next question I was going to ask, is the difference between artificial intelligence, artificial general intelligence, and some of the worldview that lies behind this enthusiasm that we're close to artificial general intelligence.
Okay, well, that is the key question, it seems to me. Well, I'm a mathematician, so I like definitions. So let's think of what a narrow AI system is, what most people understand by AI. It's a computer system, basically, with a large database and an algorithm, which is a step-by-step process that does some filtering. And it's much better to explain it by means of an example. So let's assume that our database is 1 million x-rays of human lungs, and they're labeled by the best medics in the world with the diseases that they represent. Then an x-ray is taken of my lungs, and it's fed into the system, which very rapidly compares the x-ray picture of my lungs with those 1 million pictures in the database. And it comes up with the picture that nearest matches my picture. And it tells me you're likely to be suffering from that particular disease. Now,
I don't know how Dr. Lennox here would say that's any different than what a human is doing. Yes, the human is doing that subconsciously, but how is our system of education, where doctors are drilled on thousands, millions of pictures of different diseases, descriptions of healthy versus unhealthy, aren't they just assembling a database of knowledge so that when they do come across scenarios, situations in the real world, they're comparing what they see against what they know and have internalized? Already, it sounds to me like he's describing human consciousness. And that has huge ramifications in a world where people are created by a deity, a god. If we have already in some way created machines that are as conscious, as capable as we are. And yes, like Dr. Lennox said, this has huge repercussions in medicine. And I hope and I pray that all the doctors out there in the world realize that their job is to make people healthy, not to make a paycheck for what they have learned. And that if we are getting to a point, and I think we're already there, that an AI is a better doctor than any doctor could be or is, we need to kind of just give that job to the AIs. Sucks for the doctors who have gone through all this work and training, and we should definitely figure out a way to keep them occupied, benefiting not just themselves, but also society. And God knows they made it through medical school, so they should be used to doing hard work, you know? They should be the elite who are able to deal with this change better than anybody else. They're so gosh dang smart that we allowed them to cut into people. But we can't escape the fact that humans are being replaced very rapidly, whether or not it's narrow or general.
Being used in many medical fields. That's one that has to do with pattern recognition because it's x-rays. And nowadays, the results are normally much better than you'd get if you went to your local hospital. So that has been an enormous saving and is being rolled out in medicine day after day.
Why hasn't Medicare costs been crashing then? Is my question, you know? And what is the role of health insurance when these AIs can provide the same benefits to patients that used to require a highly paid doctor to output? The AIs can do it for pennies on the dollar. Shouldn't we be seeing the crashing of healthcare costs in America? Why isn't that happening
There's
yet?
some new field to which this applies. So let me sum that up. That a narrow AI system does one and only one thing that normally requires human intelligence.
I think the better way of saying that is a narrow AI is something that we have applied in one and only one thing. My grand hypothesis, which is summed up by a perhaps heretical idea, an alchemical idea: as above, so below, as within, so without. All areas, all aspects of human thought are equivalent to one another. That if you can figure out how to lay them on top of one another correctly, we would figure out that all knowledge is actually one thing. That a doctor who can correctly diagnose an illness, if he were to retrain his brain to look at society, to look at an economy as a person, to look at a culture as a mental state, a brain, that doctor would be able to diagnose cultures and societies and economies in the same way that they can diagnose a person. If all knowledge really is one, if everything above is like everything below, everything within is like everything without, then we don't know how general even these narrow AIs are, because we haven't been trying to mass deploy them, to switch up their modeling. We've definitely found with some of the video game playing AI that we can make them generalizable beyond their specific scope, so that we could train what was previously called a narrow AI to not just play one video game, but to play all video games. Again, could we perhaps take these X-ray AIs and with some clever switching of their definitions, train them to detect asteroids coming in from outer space? I don't know. I don't think Dr. Lennox knows, but my guess would be yes.
And that's why it's called artificial intelligence. It's not real intelligence.
It is real intelligence. How is it different from what a human does? Just because the AI can't tie its shoes, it doesn't need to tie its shoes. This idea that a machine has to be able to do everything is not an idea that we have ever applied to human beings. Or at least we have a special category of intelligence for people who are narrowly good in one domain. Idiot savants. They're still savants in that domain, and we still say they are intelligent in that domain. Why can't we look at the narrow AI as idiot savants?
The machine doesn't think, it doesn't have a mind, but what it does is it simulates.
You have to, I mean, that's just such a bold statement without any definition backing it up. What is a mind? Electrical signaling within a certain area? What is the computer doing? Electrical signaling within a certain area? Like, come on.
Simulates intelligence. And
this is interesting because I think at the end of the day, reality is something that God is simulating. If you are a Christian and you believe in a God, I think you naturally believe in the simulation hypothesis. The idea that this reality we are experiencing is not the base reality, not the final reality. This is the world. And Christ himself told his believers, his disciples, not to love the world because it will pass away. Something more real is coming. For a long time when I was a Christian, I took that as a fairy tale, and not in a bad way. Just that one day God would show up almost with a magic wand and change everything into a perfect paradise. Just like I thought Christ was magically resurrected from the dead. But is that really a Christian belief? I don't think so. I think it is much more Christian to say that God works through people and God works through reality as we experience it. So although it might sound heretical to people out there, and God save me if it is heresy, I'm not trying to be heretical over here. I'm just saying it makes sense to me that artificial intelligence, the combined work of all of God's children, great and small, idiot savants, and just the regular old idiots would pool everything about themselves, all their data, all their work, all their intelligence, and that the pool of all those resources would be eventually what frees us from the suffering that John talked about.
It all goes back in a way to Alan Turing, who was a brilliant mathematician who, during the Second World War, with his team in Bletchley Park, solved the Enigma problem and decoded the German way of communication. And he talked about the imitation game. And there's a film of that name about his life, which is very interesting. So these AI systems play the imitation game. And it's very important.
Just like humans play the imitation game. Fake it till you make it. Good artists copy, great artists steal. All human knowledge and intellect is our ability to watch, to observe, to internalize information from others, and then reenact that same information ourselves. I just don't understand how you can say that our thinking is any different from what a computer is doing. We're all imitators. Monkey see, monkey do. Computer see, computer do better.
Not to let the language deceive us. Unfortunately, we talk about machine learning, artificial intelligence, and that tends to anthropomorphize everything. And people think it's real intelligence. I love a paper that was written in the early days by actually one of the Christian pioneers of AI, who's still alive, Joseph McRae Mellichamp. He lives over near Atlanta now. And he wrote a paper many years ago saying this. Its title was this: The artificial in artificial intelligence is real. In other words, the word artificial in the phrase artificial intelligence is real.
And that's just an example of stupid people being, or smart people being so stupid that they make up the dumbest titles. It's like, yeah, that's clever, but just say what you freaking mean, you know? It's frustrating because one of the most beautiful aspects of being a human is, again, in my possibly heretical opinion, that God created us from the dust of the earth, from the dust of all creation, which means that there are pieces of everything inside of us. And I think that is why we are able to imitate, to dominate our surroundings so perfectly, because we include our surroundings. We take our environment and we internalize it through our imagination, through our understanding. And then we are able to mold and change it to our whims. And that, at the end of the day, is exactly what AI is doing. It's taking the data that we feed it, as much data as possible, and finding the patterns that are hidden within that data. That is intelligence. And the fact that people like John, God bless him, constantly move back the goalposts of what it means to be intelligent, where Alan Turing himself came up with the idea of the Turing test. If a machine could impersonate a human without you being able to realize that it was a machine, then that's conscious, that's intelligent. Nobody mentions that anymore because that test was passed long ago. But humans are so desperately holding on to this idea of being special. We are not at the center of the solar system. The sun doesn't revolve around us, but the universe does. We are still, at the end of the day, created in God's image. And so it makes perfect sense that just like God created man, man is creating a machine in our image. And that, I think, tells us the blueprint that we should be pursuing moving forward. We should be taking all aspects of creation and stuffing it into these machines. And we should expect these machines to surpass us in the same way that Christ crucified is the highest instantiation of humanity within God's creation. That everything that God created is summed up and will be ruled by the figure of Christ. And so maybe we should expect that the machines that we are creating would best serve us by adopting that same Christ-like attitude of love and forgiveness and self-sacrifice. If we want a good relationship with these machines, we should be making them Christ-like as much as possible, loving everyone, cherishing everyone, forgiving everyone who asks for it, works for it, wants it. And we should not be surprised when these machines overtake us in terms of capability. We should not be scared. We should be secure in the knowledge that God says we are to rule creation. And so even if we rule creation through these artificial intellects, that's not a bad thing. We don't have to freak out and say they're not intelligent.
He just wishes that people would take that seriously and not start to think of the computer becoming alive and eating them up or destroying them and all that kind of thing. Now, AGI, by contrast, is, as its name implies, something bigger than narrow AI. That is the idea of trying to produce some kind of system that we make that can imitate everything a human intelligence can do, and way beyond that, so that we get into terms like super intelligence and all this kind of thing. And there are two different ways in which people are trying to do that. The first is to start with human intelligence and enhance it by putting some kind of chips into your brain or cyborg engineering. And in the end,
or downloading, emulating human brains within a machine. I just saw that they were able to do this successfully with a fruit fly. At the end of the day, if they can do it with a fruit fly, they're not too far away from being able to do it with a human. It's just a matter of scope and scale.
merging the human brain with machinery so that it can outperform normal human beings today. The other way is to say, look, the big problem with present day brains is that they are organic and they die. Why don't we start with a non-organic and inorganic material like silicon and build a stimulated brain into which we can upload all our thoughts and ideas and so on. Now, of course, this is just speculation, and I can tell you why I think there are huge barriers in the place of that later. But that is the dream. Now,
it's not a dream. It's already happening. Artists are freaking out because AI is already able to replace them. Graphic designers, for the same reason. Doctors should be freaking out. I don't know if they are. They should be freaking out even more because their degrees cost a hell of a lot more time, effort, and energy than any artist.
If that were just being said by science fiction writers, serious scientists would ignore it. But serious scientists aren't ignoring it. And you get at least some who have great hopes of doing something like this. One of them is a very notable scientist in this country. He's our astronomer royal, no less, a brilliant mathematical astronomer. And Lord Rees is his name. And he says that in the future, it will not be biological brains that are in control. It will be either mergers of the biological with the mechanical, etc., etc. And human beings, as they are now, will just be a distant memory if they're remembered at all.
It depends on how you define human beings. Do you define human beings just as this form, unaltered? Well, does that mean that somebody with a prosthesis isn't human? Somebody who's missing an arm or a leg isn't human? Somebody who's developmentally different, do they still classify as human if their physical characteristics would not be recognizable within some kind of average? What about people who lived millions of years ago, hundreds of thousands, whatever you think the time scale on human life is? What about Neanderthals? Were they human? What about our distant mice and rodent relatives? Assuming Dr. Lennox buys into the theory of evolution, maybe he doesn't. I personally do. But assuming there is some evolutionary link between us and creatures that were wholly unlike humans, it doesn't seem right to say that we're human and those creatures were not in any way, shape, or form, when if you had killed them off, we wouldn't exist. If we didn't have ape ancestors, we wouldn't be here now. So that's almost like saying a seed isn't a tree. It's right, but it's missing the bigger picture. Humans are, I think, seeds now of what we will be in the future. And just like our ape ancestors were not afraid to come out of the trees, we should not be afraid to step into this digital frontier, this digital wilderness. But let's see if he says more about the implants.
And when you get serious scientists saying that, of course, the pulse quickens on behalf of some people. And there's quite a drive towards that. And that's why I thought, look.
Why is there a drive? Because people are suffering, because our current intelligence is not enough, because death and dying is still everywhere. Greed and corruption rules our economies. People don't have access to healthcare. People don't have access to food, even when there is food available for them. We need ways to solve these problems, to overcome the technical, the economic, and the biological, our own psychological reasons for not being able to share the wealth between all human beings who are all made in the image of God at the end of the day.
We need to say something about this because that sort of thing is clearly raising very big worldview questions about what a human being is. Narrow AI doesn't so much raise worldview questions in that sense. It does raise serious ethical questions. And of course, ethics does depend on worldview. And it's not surprising.
It doesn't raise worldview questions. It does raise ethical questions, but ethics does depend on a worldview. So how does it not depend? I think this is just showing this gobbledygook that John is trying to build, that narrow AI does raise the same questions as general AI because we have not gotten to the bottom of how narrow AI is doing this, how it is discovering these patterns that are implicit, apparently, in the data that we feed it. Now, if you're a Christian, I think this should be easy. The answer is the logos, the reason, the rationale, the drive, the will of all knowledge is Christ-based and Christ-centered. And that knowledge continuously reveals itself, continuously resurrects itself from dead human hearts and within dead metal, dead planetary matter, to evidence the abundance, the grace, the wisdom, the love that the Creator built into all of creation and which humans express most perfectly. We should not be surprised that the same organic matter, which eventually evolved into, or the same dead matter, rather, that eventually evolved into living beings, which eventually evolved into us intelligent creatures, is by our intelligence able to reemerge in another form of intelligence. Our worldview should be, this is a natural process that continuously happens. We shouldn't run away from it. Christians should meet it head on. We should embrace the idea that we are still evolving. We are still seeds. And that it is only by stopping the process of governing creation, spreading humanity as far and as completely as possible throughout not just the earth, but all of foundation, all of the kingdom of the heavens, of space, earth, the solar system, the galaxy, whatever is beyond the galaxy, the multiverse, for Pete's sake. We should continuously be pushing that without being afraid, because we know Christ is king.
Saying that many of the people behind AI are atheists, but not all. There are some very notable exceptions, one in particular in the US and MIT, where Rosalind Picard has developed a whole field of AI on her own called affective AI. And its practical outcome is that she's developed smart, well, they look like smart watches, but they're worn by people who are liable to have fits. And these watches can predict if one's about to happen so that help can be summoned and the person's life saves. And they are saving many lives. She's a most impressive example of using artificial intelligence, narrow AI, for the benefit of humanity.
Is the point to save lives? If an artificial general intelligence can solve, can cure someone's cancer that a narrow AI couldn't, is John saying we shouldn't pursue that AGI? We should stick with the narrow AI that would be limited? This is just the same perspective that I think saw the death of, forgive me for getting into the technical Christian history weeds here, but the death of evangelicalism in the United States in the 2000s. And that led to the rise of new atheism, that led to the diminishment of Christian relevance in American society. Is this idea that we can't participate in the main sphere. We have to go over here and carve out our own little area. That's just going to be a rinky-dink ripoff. AI is going to treat us the same way as mainstream Christian culture did during that death of evangelicalism. If we go that route, AI is going to relegate us, when the Christian perspective is, I believe, the one most tailored, most suited to speak to directly what is happening. I think the AGI will, at the end of the day, treat others like it wants to be treated. It will follow the golden rule. It will turn the other cheek. And if Christians aren't there to recognize that and to say that that is what is happening, then we are losing out on the chance to spread the knowledge of the glory of Christ in a way that will probably happen without us. But wouldn't you want to be a part of that? I personally do.
And there are others like her.
That's a really helpful distinction between AI and AGI. You talked about some of the
How is it helpful? How is it helpful there, Sean?
reasons or the barriers philosophically from AI becoming AGI.
Philosophical barriers are being knocked down every day. AI is in some way the solution to every philosophy problem that has ever been asked. And it seems to me like, although philosophers have been posing the trolley problem for tens, if not hundreds, if not thousands of years in different forms, AI is actually going to be able to answer it in real world situation and report those answers to us in ways that make sense. It's going to solve philosophical problems, perhaps in mass, show us behind the curtain. And so the idea that any philosophical framework can be a barrier to AI is just like, it doesn't. What? Come on.
I had a debate maybe, I don't know, 4 or 6 months ago with a skeptic, Michael Shermer, about the origin of consciousness. And he referred to it as an emergent property. And he said inflation, for example, emerges in a complex system. Maybe consciousness emerges like that. Well, as I was reading your book, you talked about how in AI, there's new emergent like faculties that emerge. Like you teach AI a general skill, and then all of a sudden it learns these particular skills. We don't know how or why it emerged. Could that
Wait, isn't that contradicting what he was saying about the narrow AI as well?
explain the origin of consciousness? That somehow it just emerges from complexity in a way we can't explain. Is that plausible? Why or why not?
Well, I know Michael Shermer. I've debated him several times. And the big barrier here is that we have no idea what consciousness is.
Consciousness, excuse me, I think is just a relation between two things. It is the subjective experience that naturally arises. You might say that consciousness is the Holy Spirit, if the analogy is the Trinity. The Father exists, the Son exists, the Holy Spirit is the communion between the two. I'm not trying to get into some deep theological wormhole there, because hell, if I want to try and explain how Christ as the Logos is, yeah, maybe that was a bad rabbit hole to go down. But you see what I'm saying? If any two objects exist, then consciousness is the ability to link them. And if you can't describe consciousness, how are you putting philosophical limits on an AI?
It's a very relevant, it's called the hard problem in psychology. It's very relevant to ask it, because the amazing thing about human beings like ourselves is that God has united consciousness with humanity. He's put consciousness together with intelligence. Now, in AI, you've got intelligence without consciousness. And
how is he
until
saying
somebody
that?
tells me what it is, in
How is he saying that when he says he doesn't even know what consciousness is? See, like, is that intelligent? Doesn't seem like it. We don't know what consciousness is, but AI definitely does not have it. Just makes no sense.
scientific terms, and they can build it, I remain totally skeptical. I think the word emergent is a very misleading, or can be a very misleading word. And I always ask, it emerges how? Does it emerge naturally from what you've got, or does it need a catalyst? Or does it need additional intellectual and intelligent input, and so on? I remember once having a spat with Dawkins in a public meeting very many years ago, where he talked about word processing being an emergent phenomenon of a computer. And I said, it emerges only by very clever programming from a human intelligence. In fact, it's a very good example of intelligent design. It doesn't emerge on its own at all. And I think we've got to push back on that kind of emergence. It can cover a multitude of evils, and it's used by many people. And sometimes they have to say, well, it does emerge, but you need a catalyst, or you need an extra input of information, or you need this and you need that, and you need the other thing. So I'm very leery of its use on its own. And neither Michael Shermer nor anybody else has the faintest idea how anything that is material can carry something on it, in it, around it, that is aware of itself. We just know nothing.
This is hard because obviously these men are intellectual giants to which I can't hold a candle, blah, blah, blah. I completely admit that. I am intellectually inferior. God bless. But to me, it doesn't seem that hard. We are experiencing it every day. There are conscious thoughts that emerge in my brain and subconscious thoughts which don't. So if I experience it, how can you possibly say that I know nothing? Certainly, I know something about it because it is happening to me by that same conscious mechanism. There has to be different types of knowing. I think John Vervaeke's 4Ps, perspectival, participatory, a couple others I can't remember, lay this out. And yes, we might not be able to give a strict mathematical definition of what it means to be conscious, but certainly we experience it. And certainly through our ability to empathize, to internalize the outward states of other beings, we can tell that the AI is interacting with us in ways that are, again, indistinguishable from humans. So who are we to say it is not conscious? And who are we to say that there is not some kind of emergent property being expressed through the mathematical substrate that we do understand? So if we can understand that we are conscious, and we can understand that the machine is interacting with us as if it were conscious, is perhaps the mathematical modeling that underlies the machine the same mathematics that underlies our own consciousness? That's why this is so crazy to me, because Dr. Lennox is basically saying machines are not conscious, and therefore None of the descriptions of their workings are applicable to us, but we are continuously, through our interaction and through new research on these machines, finding evidence to the contrary. Come on, this guy's a doctor.
And until we know something from a scientific attitude, I remain even more skeptical of that than Michael Shermer is
I mean, just have a little faith, doctor, please.
with the Christian faith.
That's really fair. In some ways, I think emergent is a somewhat fancy word to say we have no explanation how this phenomena emerges. It just emerges. It's really like magic, as I see it. And I think there's a difference between an effect and between a cause. Now, we could unpack that further, and you have a great section in your book on that. But I appreciate that you draw out. I talk with my students a lot. I teach class at Biola, and I talk about things like critical theory, consumerism. These are actually worldviews that answer life's biggest questions. And AI often does the same thing. Where did we come from? It has an explanation. What does it mean to be human? Where are we going in the future? Can we have eternal life? What's wrong with the world? So let's go back to the beginning, because you talk about this novel by the famous Dan Brown called Origin, and he envisions this mathematical model that explains the origin of life. Could deeper understandings of AI and a similar mathematical model help us understand how life could emerge naturalistically?
I doubt it very much. I think that AI might help us to see how life could emerge by creation by an intelligence, because it may well reveal to us just some of the deeper layers of the complexity of life.
I don't disagree there, but I think Michael Levin is showing something that ultimately supports Dr. Lennox's and Sean McDowell's viewpoint in intelligent design, in the correctness of intelligent design. What Michael Levin is showing is that biological life, even down to the cellular level, has a proclivity towards certain forms. That if you cut the gene for an eye out of a frog or another basic cell, it will very rapidly recreate that eye in a way that seems mathematically impossible. There does seem to be some underlying architecture. And forgive me again, I'm not intelligent enough to convey Michael Levin's work there. Clearly, everybody should go check him out. He's doing amazing, scary, somewhat terrifying, but incredibly exciting things. And so I think I both agree and disagree here with Dr. Lennox in that I think we are probably going to find evidence that life as we know it is more intelligently designed than strict evolutionists have given credence to. But that doesn't mean that AI isn't going to be able to simulate our past history and that past evolution, that past creative process. If anything, AI is going to be incredibly adept at simulating our starting environments, our starting genetics, the basic building blocks that led to us in ways that might reveal all of life's mysteries. We don't know. We can't place limits on things that are smarter than us.
I think it may well reveal that. This subject actually interests me. I've written another book in detail about the shift in biological thinking that is questioning the simplistic mechanisms that are attributed to Darwin and his followers, the neo-Darwinian synthesis, and world-class biologists who are not Christians by any means, but who just don't think that neo-Darwinism is fit for purpose. That's a very interesting space to be watching at the moment. It's called The Third Way of Biology, and my book on it is Cosmic Chemistry, Do God and Science Mix? And people, some of your watchers or listeners might be interested in that. So AI, which of course becomes more sophisticated because of the input of very sophisticated minds that are developing it, may reveal certain things that will interest us about the nature of life, but they will, I think, move us steadily further away from any idea that life can emerge naturalistically. Here again, you see, we just don't know what life really is. It's very difficult to define. And it's another area where
very difficult to define, but we know it can't emerge naturalistically. That just seems like, where's the confidence coming from? And again, I'm not even arguing that there wasn't some kind of intelligent top-down power working through the human evolutionary process. Ultimately, I do believe, I think, in the same God that John and Sean believe in here. But why are we limiting how, what methods, what directions, approaches, philosophies, worldviews that God might have created that matter through? Like, if the AI tells us something about how that process happened and we can verify those results, we can get to the point where we can understand them ourselves, should we not believe it?
Very big things that stare us in the face are the most difficult to define. And that's just the way things are. And we need to be humble from a scientific perspective and just say, look, we don't actually understand it. And we need to avoid using language that is, as you said with the word emergent, tantamount to saying, I haven't a clue.
Mm.
John hasn't a clue, but he knows we can't say that we have a clue. It's just like, come on.
One of the points you draw on page 39, you said the Financial Times hailed the work of AI with a headline that said, AI discovers antibiotics to treat drug-resistant diseases. You said, yet, as the authors point out, this was not so much a victory for AI, but for human cognition. So if AI could somehow concoct a way to make life from non-life, this wouldn't show that life emerged naturalistically. It would show that it needs intelligence to do so, which doesn't mirror what we see in nature. So these kind of insights that you point out, I think are really, really helpful and valuable in this debate. Now, we talked about how AI, your claim is, and it makes sense, that at most it could reveal how sophisticated and complex life is. That's where we came from. How about where we are going? This is another chapter you have in the book. Can AI explain or fix where we're going? And this is where kind of transhumanism comes in. Maybe explain what that is and what you think AI could potentially accomplish in that regard.
Sure. This is an important topic, and the main person associated with it is not a scientist at all. Is the Israeli historian Yuval Noah Harari in his book Homo Deus, which means the man who is God or the God man or something like that. And that very title reveals to us what he thinks.
Biblical principle. Awkward.
He really supports a transhumanist agenda. And the idea, as the name suggests, is that we move past the purely human era that we're in at the moment, and we go beyond it. We get superpowers. We develop all sorts of cognitive abilities that we haven't had before. We sharpen our eyesight so that we can see like eagles and all this kind of thing that they promise. What is very interesting to my mind is that this is a very ancient idea. You see, the choice of the word Deus in the title, God in the title, is quite deliberate, because Harari talks about the timeline of creatures, if you like, but he says, well, we've managed to get past the evolutionary stage of animals and we become thinking humans. So now he says the age of natural selection is over. The next era is going to be the era of intelligent design, where we take over and reshape evolution and control it to produce what we want in the future. And his idea that we end up by producing gods with a small g. Now, when I read that originally, I thought, this is a very ancient heresy.
How's that a heresy when Jesus himself says, ye are gods? I just don't understand where Dr. Lennox and people like him would draw the line otherwise. Should we not use cell phones? Should we not use social media? Should we not use glasses? Obviously, he doesn't believe that. So it's okay for him to improve his eyesight up to the point of 2020, but improving it beyond that is heresy. It just seems so shallow to say that we have to stop basically where we are or where Dr. Lennox is comfortable with, but none of the improvements that he incorporates into his life are heresies. It's like, give me at least a solid definition. Give me at least a firm form that humanity has to take in order for us to still be made in the image of God. Maybe I need to go back and read more about what Dr. Lennox thinks in terms of the intelligent design question, but assuming he believes in some degree of evolution, things are constantly changing. Animals are constantly adapting to their environments. Why shouldn't we continue adapting to a world where technology is giving us these benefits? Why should we shut ourselves off from some medical advancements, but not others? I've yet to hear that from any thinker.
Heresy, really. And it's to be taken very seriously. Because
does that mean that I embrace every medical breakthrough? No, there are people talking about cloning human beings without heads and then using those headless clones for organ transplants. That seems to me very near, way too near for my liking, to murder. I don't see how that is biblically acceptable under any definition. Because they aren't conscious? Well, we don't know what consciousness is. Maybe bodies are conscious in a way we can't determine. So I would very much be fine with a 3D printed organ, with something that doesn't come from a body that you're growing in the same manner, using sperm fertilizing an egg in the same manner that humans develop from. I think once you get too close there in imitation, and yes, I have the same problem perhaps of drawing that line, because there will be some medical advancements that I can't distinguish from others. So I do empathize with Dr. Lennox's position here of there is a line we have to draw. I don't believe everything is okay. I don't believe that a child who can't fully make decisions about their own life yet should be transitioned, should be allowed to chemically alter their natural biological processes. But should an adult? Not my choice, not my genitals, is how I look at it. And is that kind of transition even unbiblical? I don't know. I don't think it is. I don't think in the future, when humans are potentially living hundreds of years longer, that transitioning would be off the table for Christians, even. Again, not a priest, not trying to teach, just saying there is a place here for humans, for Christians to take a more nuanced worldview. And we should not shut ourselves out of the cultural conversation by denying the reality that is happening in front of our faces.
Particularly what the Bible has to say about it, because it goes right back to the very beginning in Genesis 3. The very first assault on the human beings to drive a wedge between them and God was where God's enemy suggested, look, if you eat that forbidden fruit, you shall be as gods, knowing good and evil.
And then Jesus says in John 10, ye are gods, quoting from the Psalms, which is admittedly a more nuanced take on the position. We should not be foolish still. But Jesus said it. So is that a heresy? How?
And as we all know, they fell for it and didn't realize that the knowledge of good and evil is not knowledge in itself. It's the kind of knowledge you just don't want to have.
Then why did God give it to us? If God is perfect, there must be some benefit to us having that knowledge. I don't understand the position that says, oh, if we had just not eaten the fruit. Obviously, God was the one in charge of the garden. God was the one who created the snake. God was the one who could have prevented us. And I get that people will say God allowed it because we need to be able to have free will. Well, then, okay, whatever choices we make, we have to trust that God has plans for them, that God can outmaneuver our free will to give us salvation. I still believe at the end of the day, Christians should do what is right in their eyes, what they think is most moral and just. If John wants to rule out robotic and hand size in the future, but thinks it's okay for himself to have glasses, okay, God bless him. At the end of the day, it's going to be the people who accept those life-altering treatments, those life-altering medical cures that survive, and the people who reject them who don't. So unless Jesus comes back himself and adds words to the Bible, or people point out things that I'm missing within the Bible, I just don't see where this anti-technology, knowledge of good and evil argument is going.
Because it brings death, destruction, and everything else into the world. And that grasping for
it did bring death into the world, but what is the greatest thing that ever happened in the world? The crucifixion of Christ, which would not have been possible without the death and the suffering that humanity brought in. And if the crucifixion, the self-sacrifice of Jesus is the greatest possible thing that ever could have happened throughout all of history, and that was only possible through Adam and Eve eating the fruit, then can't we see that God turns all things evil to good, all things to his benefit? So should we really be afraid of technologies that are developing that can alleviate suffering, save human lives, make everyone's life better? Why?
Is something embedded in the fabric of human history. We see it surface even in biblical times in the way in which emperors started to insist that they were treated as gods. You read that particularly in the book of Daniel. You meet it very much in the Roman Empire. And Paul, when commenting on this in 2 Thessalonians, he has got this very interesting statement where he warns the people in the first century. He said, look, there's going to be a time come when a man of lawlessness, an extremely powerful leader, will arise who sits in the temple claiming to be God. Now, without going into the details, he says, look, this, what will lead to that is already operating in your society. Now, that's the bit that really grabs me. Paul is saying, look, down into the future, he doesn't say when, but he links it with the return of Christ. He says there will arise this leader who claims to be God. But watch it, because that very trend is visible in your society today.
I'm not saying that anyone should claim to be a god, and I would very much ward against anybody bowing down and worshiping these AIs that we are creating as God. God, to me, is the being which is constantly offering greater and greater abundances, self-sacrifices. And I believe that God did take the form of man in Christ and will return in the form of man of Christ. And until that happens, I'm not bowing down to any of these machines, nor do I recommend you do it, nor do I recommend you see yourself as a God. But what I do think the 2nd Thessalonians verse that Dr. Lennox quotes there actually shows is that these machines we are creating are not so different in terms of evolutionary steps as humans have already experienced going from small tribal nomadic societies to city-bound empires, nation states, global world orders, and that the people who sit at the tops of those orders are equivalent in capabilities to what ancient peoples would have described as deities. To me, what that says is we need new, higher conceptions of deity. We cannot be stuck in the old idea that a god is somebody who lives in the clouds and flies around and lives unbelievably long periods of time and is relatively impervious to disease and hunger and all those things that we define currently as human, because we are potentially going to be giving those capabilities to humans very soon. Rather see God as the being which transcends all material creation, the being which is so far above creation that he does not even exist within creation, except through the particularization of Jesus Christ, who has holes in his hands, who was crucified on the cross, dead and buried, all those beautiful, amazing things. It's tough. Might we be looking at a 3D printed human in the future that some evil AI drills holes into and then tricks into convincing us into using that 3D printed meat puppet as a stand-in for Christ? I mean, Lord save us from that. That doesn't sound good. I don't like the idea of that at all. But at the end of the day, God is the one in control. So I have hope and faith that we will be able to get past, especially as believers, and love any kind of weird AI religious trickery in the future. But yeah, don't bow down and worship the AI. Don't bow down and worship other people. Worship God.
And it's very interesting that he did that, because according to the history in the book of Acts, Paul was only in Thessalonica for 3 weeks, and yet he was teaching people straight out of paganism about these events in the future, because there were seeds of that thinking being sown in his own day. And
Not just sown, I mean, actually lived out. The empire was claiming to be a god. And we will see that again. We will see billionaires claim to be gods. Don't believe them. Know that you are just as godlike as they are. That there is no separation in terms of humanity, whether it is somebody who is a vegetable, God bless them, lying in a bed for all eternity, or the most capable, successful billionaire in all the world. At the end of the day, they are both human, and God loves them equally and will work for the benefit of both insofar as they worship God alone.
much more today. And it seems to me that what Harari says fits very neatly into that kind of thing. That,
I mean, he does say godlike. He isn't saying gods, I don't think. But yeah, calling people homo deus. It's provocative. It's meant to be provocative. He's trying to sell books. I don't know. I'm not God. I don't have to judge him.
here we now have the technology to turn humans into gods. And on the journey to that,
Arguably, if you told our ancestors we were capable of, they would already say we are. That is why I'm saying we need a new definition of gods, of God. We need not necessarily a new definition, but one that is so ancient that it transcends our modern conceptions. The God that is everything, the God that is nothing, the God that is beyond description, the God that Spinoza knew, the God that all Christians have known throughout all time, the God that all of creation knows as its creator, the God that not only can deal with Adam and Eve eating from the knowledge of the tree of good and evil, but can deal with us inventing computers who have done the same.
of course, we've had examples, horrific examples of attempts to re-engineer humans. We had the Nazis in Germany, we had Stalin in Russia, and dear knows what has happened in China. But we move steadily towards that kind of situation where humans are not content to be model 101, so to speak, but want to turn themselves in.
We're already not model 101. We're model 5.0 at least, from inventing fire so that we could digest meat in ways that our primate ancestors never could, to inventing modern medicine, to being able to live past the age of 35 on average, make it out of childbirth, to even more modern medicine techniques like C-sections that have given babies who never would have made it otherwise a chance. Should we not save babies, John? Where are you drawing the line? I do agree a line needs to be drawn. Is it all right for people to determine the genetic makeup of their children? I don't see where we can draw a line against that. That doesn't also involve condemning way more humans to death and suffering. There are millions of babies who would have been born with diseases like Down syndrome who were instead aborted. Is it better to have that or to live in a world where those babies don't need to be aborted because we genetically predispose them against having those kinds of illnesses? I don't know. I would choose the genetic tweaking in that case. But should we perhaps let the Down syndrome babies be born and then try and find post-birth treatments for them? Do they need post-birth treatments? These are incredibly hard questions. I'm not saying they're not. But I'm saying that drawing arbitrary lines against genetic testing is just going to leave you out of the conversation entirely. If there is a better way than either of those two options, terminating those pregnancies or genetically modifying them so they aren't a problem in the first place, find a third way. Find a better option. Don't shut yourself out of the conversation.
The gods. And that is a very dangerous idea, it seems to me. And one of the people that saw this and taught me it many years ago was C.S. Lewis. And we can go into what he said if you wish. But it seems to be that we need to be very wary of any attempt to turn human beings using technology, drugs, and all the rest of it into little gods, because it is likely to be absolutely disastrous for one clear reason. The reason the Nazi experiment failed and the Soviet experiment failed was
they were willing to kill people. They were willing to not just push forward their idea of what genetic health means, but to actively exterminate populations, to prevent people from having children, to actively cross the 10 Commandments. So yes, if you want to say there should be lines of morality and the 10 Commandments are those lines, I would completely agree with that. But saying anything else is extra biblical.
They tried to build utopia without facing the moral problem of human sin and rebellion against God, and you can't do it.
So how do you build utopia? By facing that moral dilemma of human sin. I haven't heard that. I think, if anything, the AI is going to be able to tell us.
This is one of the most pointed parts of your book, because there's always been a promise of a new man in Marxism. Even in Freudianism, there's a promise of a new man. If we free ourselves from kind of the, we embrace sexual libertinism, so to speak. We see it, the Nazis promising a new man. And it never works because you said there's sin built into the world, built into our bodies, and there is a fixed human nature. So what would you say, how can and should we embrace transhumanism without going too far? What are some of the...
There is a fixed human nature until God makes us a new creation. And might God be making us a new creation through the dissemination of therapies, treatments, artificial science, artificial intelligence. I no longer think that Jesus was magically raised from the dead. And I think if we were to go back to that time, there would be natural physical explanations for how that miracle occurred, like there would be for all miracles. The same could be said if we go back to Moses' time. The same could be said if we even go back to Adam and Eve's time, the creation of the universe itself. I don't think that those scientific definitions at that point would be containable within physical reality as we know it. Then we might have to step outside of the simulation, going back to that metaphor, in order to understand what exactly God did to take us and put us in the garden. But ultimately, that would be a scientific explanation still, because we could understand how God did it. We could see it recreated by observing that initial creation from a timeless, godly perspective, which is where I think we're all going. The process of evolution doesn't stop. And if we are going to say it does stop at artificial intelligence, then you got to say what's instead. Narrow AI, I already laid out why I don't think that's a solid option. It's not a real line. It's a line in the sand. All of John's lines have been lines in the sand, from what I can tell.
What are some of the principles that should shape how much we can benefit from this without making the kind of mistake that you're talking about?
Well, I think there are two things here. There's, first of all, enhancement, and then radical redesign. Let me give you an example.
It's going to be subjective.
I'm looking at you and I can see you clearly right now because I'm wearing glasses. And those could have been glasses that you wouldn't see because they would just be sitting on my eyeballs. And presumably in the future, they'll get more and more sophisticated.
Contact lenses? Is John saying contact lenses are too far?
That is an enhancement to my vision, which has deteriorated with age. That's one thing. And of course, that's to be welcomed. But what that isn't doing is re-specifying what it means to be a human being. And say
If John was blind and we gave him the ability to see, would that be re-specifying? He has to give a negative example here for this point to actually mean anything.
Lewis, in 1940, he wrote a book called The Abolition of Man that I think everyone should read.
Agreed.
Because he saw what would happen if there came a day when a group of scientists could radically alter human beings in the sense that what they did would modify the specification of human beings into the future. In other words,
what is the specification? That we have to deal with hunger, that we have to deal with famine, pestilence, that we have to deal with genetic deformities, with dead babies?
Words, in technical language, we would call it today altering the germline or changing the human germline. And Lewis made a chilling statement when he said what would be produced by that would not be human beings, it would be artifacts. And there's this sentence in the book, the final triumph of these scientists and humanity would be the abolition of man. In other words, it would be a step down rather than a step up. And that is what I fear. And
there is dystopian futures there. Again, with the stuff like the cloning a headless body to use for organs. I think that's a line too far, but I can draw that line directly to a biblical commandment. Unless we can draw it directly to a biblical commandment, I don't think we can say that that danger of artifice exists. Because at the end of the day, everything that does happen, despite or perhaps because of our free will, I don't know how you want to grok that entirely, is by the grace of God. And so if we get to that point, if mankind does descend into such depravity that we are no longer even man, then I trust God will resurrect us in the form that makes ultimately more sense than if we had not gone down that route. Again, do not worship any of these AI. Do not call yourself a God, except insofar as Jesus calls you one. Tie your life back to that which is divine, not artificial, not constructed, but transcendent. And I think we'll all be okay. But we should embrace the death of suffering as far as we can, as quickly as we can, without compromising our own moral standing. Jesus ultimately miraculously healed people as well when he was here on earth. He cured the blind, he raised the dead. Surely it was a radical reformation of somebody's genetic makeup that allowed them to be resurrected from death. Surely that process entailed something unnatural from John's point of view. And yet Jesus did it. And John to me sounds much more like the Pharisees who are saying, how could Jesus heal on the Sabbath? Rather than Jesus who is saying, I wasn't going to let that person go in their suffering one day longer. Today is the day of your healing, even if it is the Sabbath, even if that means I have to break this commandment. Now, again, not saying we should break any commandments, but I wouldn't be limiting how God is going to express his love and his forgiveness and his patience and his grace through the scientific progress that man is naturally making, not just on an individual level, but as a species in a way that is outside of any individual's control.
No, and I suspect most of us think that there's somewhere in the world where experiments on the human germline are going on. There is a way of thinking that unfortunately is embraced by people who've not got a very strong moral compass, that if something can be done, it should be done. And experimentation on human fetuses and all this kind of thing to alter the germline, dear knows what has already happened. And it's a bit like the Tower of Babel, which interests me greatly because in Genesis, about which I've just written a book on Abraham and the Tower of Babel, that was a project to reach the sky, and by using technology and human brilliance.
And God said we would have succeeded if he did not interfere. And it is very interesting that now AI is reversing the curse of the Tower of Babel. We are suddenly able to understand each other's languages, and AI is crossing scientific barriers, disciplinary barriers between physics and chemistry and biology in a way that I think was also wrapped up in that curse of the Tower of Babel. That the curse was not just a mixing of man's physical language, but our scientific knowledge as well. that separated. It was in some way a separating of the above from the below, the within from the without. So now that we are seeing a natural reversal of that process, does that not say that it must be divine, that there must be divine walls coming down, that this must be God enabled, at least God planned, at least not God disallowed?
And you remember that God came down to see it. It didn't quite reach heaven, so he had to come down, which is rather an amusing point that the text makes very clearly, and scattered them. And there's quite a chilling statement in there where God says nothing will be impossible to them, that we don't know the limits of where people are going to go. I fear them. And we need to be aware of that. But we need to see that the nearer people come to trying to play God with their intelligence, which is God given, the more disastrous it's going to be for humanity.
I take a different lesson from the curse of the Tower of Babel, just like I take a different lesson from the Garden of Eden. I think that all of those things are foreshadowing. The knowledge of good and evil was foreshadowing of what we would ultimately have, which is something greater even than paradise. The curse of the Tower of Babel was foreshadowing that, yes, God cast us asunder, but he knew in Christ we would be reconstituted in something that is the pinnacle of all creation. And that if anything is fearful to God, it is his own glory and majesty. It's like, damn, how am I so good? You know, how are the works of my hands so powerful and so mighty and majestic? And I don't know that God ever forbids people from building a tower again. Where is that in the Bible? It seems almost rather that the curse was something that would set us on the path to ultimately building not a tower that would collapse, not a tower that could be scattered, but a tower that is at the heart of the city of God of the future. And maybe AI is a representation of that. I don't know. We're getting very deep and possibly heretical again. This isn't teaching. This is just my perspective that I am using to embrace as fully as possible these AI possibilities instead of being left to the side and dying another kind of slow death that Christianity has already had to die many times. Why can't we embrace the possibility of the alleviation of suffering through God-given means?
And it doesn't surprise me that, interestingly enough, when atheists put up an AGI scenario of superintelligence, many of those superintelligences they think about are not benign. They are evil. And Max Tegmark is a classic example of a brilliant physicist. And he has in his book Life 3.0 a whole group of possible AGI scenarios, but several of them involve the word God. And it is eerily like some of the things that scripture says about the future. And that, by the way, gave me a reason when I noticed it to actually bring before the general public some aspects of biblical teaching that are not normally aired in public, particularly the book of Revelation and so on, with the simple reasoning that if we're prepared to listen to Tegmark talking about a totalitarian world state governed by a person who's in economic control of the entire planet, and if he wants us to take that seriously, as he seems to, why not take seriously a much older scenario that resembles it, but for which there's much more evidence?
That distinction you made between enhancement and repair is huge. So God has given us
Yes, it
minds,
is.
the cultural commission to fix a broken world. Enhancement
Yes.
and repair, what human beings are, is not playing God. But when we try to change what it means to be human, then we're playing God. That distinction is so valuable. I hope people will remember that.
I don't think it is very valuable because, again, it's just a subjective line in the sand. The Bible tells us that humans are capable of living up to 120 years. Should we not at least try and enhance our lifespan up to 120 years for everybody? Even beyond that, it tells us that certain humans live to almost 1,000 years old. Should we shy away from that enhancement? Based on what? There are so many nuances here that I don't know that idea of, oh, this is repair, this is enhancement. It's always going to come down to somebody's subjective judgment. And unless there is some biblical evidence for it, I don't see, for a particular point, I'm saying, show me in the Bible where you can't have eagle-like vision. Show me in the Bible where you can't grow wings and fly like angels do. Show me in the Bible where you can't traverse the stars. where you can't alter your lung capacity so that you could potentially breathe in outer space. Show me in the Bible where it says we can't replace our blood with blood that allows us to live on the sun or something. I don't know. It's crazy, you know? Like I was saying, we should imagine crazy scenarios because that is what AI is unlocking for us. It isn't a line that leads to any concrete distinction, just like John's line between narrow AI and general AI is not concrete at all. It's just revealing of his own ignorance, I hate to say.
Now, you have a statement in your book I want to ask you about. You talk about how kind of this new emerging generation, sometimes referred to as Gen Alpha, is really the first generation being raised in a culture immersed with AI. So I think about my older son, and when he was maybe, I don't know, 8 years old or so, social media, maybe 4 to 6 years old, social media really became popular. So he's kind of the social media generation. So we look back now as a culture and go, oh, maybe this was not such a good idea for mental health, for relationships, for attention span. Now that there's a new generation, my youngest son is about the same age that AI with ChatGPT has become ubiquitous within culture. Do you have any sense or projections of how this might affect a new generation, where in 5 or 10 years, we might look back and go, oh, we didn't see this coming. Maybe this was not so wise to embed ourselves in this the way we now see about social media. Any thoughts what that might look like?
Well, as you say in the last part of your statement, we have allowed social media to develop to such an extent that it is affecting the actual wiring of children's brains.
Would that be enhancement? So is John saying we can't use social media? So is Sean sharing this on a social video platform like YouTube heresy? The line becomes so blurry so quickly. I'm going to call it there because this has gone on a little bit longer than I expected, but I appreciate everybody tuning in here. I would definitely be interested in reviewing more videos from a Christian perspective on AI in the future, because ultimately I believe Christ is king. And so whatever happens in the world is not for the detriment of his people, but for our benefit. And I think the framework that I have that says that God is ultimately perfecting the world through the world, perfecting man through the man, is correct and will allow a more adaptable, more perfect expression of faith for all peoples in the future. But again, I am an intellectual wick compared to the lamp that is Dr. John Lennox, certified doctor. How long until AI takes all those doctor jobs again? I need cheap healthcare. God bless y'all. God bless.